bet you thought I wouldn't go over judgments. I thought of you, don't worry. So judgments is simply if we as a state are going to uphold and enforce a judgment from another state or another country. Judgments are literally just what another court has decided, and we don't always have to acknowledge that judgment. We can ignore it depending on a few things. Now, if we choose to enforce it, it's going to be because of a few questions that we get to and how we answer those questions. So when you see anything about a judgment, you just have to take a step back and ask a few questions, and that's going to be, okay, who is involved here? Where did everything happen? And who decided the judgment itself, okay? So when looking at a judgment, the first real question you're going to ask is if the judgment was valid. You're like, okay, what does that mean? So what I mean by is the judgment valid is, did the court have subject matter jurisdiction over that lawsuit? Or did they have personal jurisdiction over that lawsuit? It's important because if that court did not have jurisdiction over those parties, the judgment can't be enforced because they have no authority over those people in the first place. So you have to ask whether they have authority over these people in the first place, either because of where they lived, or because of what happened, or because of the court it was filed in. If there's no jurisdiction, then the judgment's not going to be validly enforced because it's going to be held to have been invalid because there was no jurisdiction. You can't exercise power over someone if you don't have jurisdiction. So you ask, was it a valid judgment? Now, part of that is, okay, look at all the legal proceedings that happened in this judgment. If it appears that there was a jurisdiction, then you have to ask yourself, is this the final, conclusive end? You're like, why is that important? A judgment is favored, and typically courts are going to want to honor a judgment of another state because nobody wants to continue arguing about something that happened years and years and years ago. We want finality as a court. We want an end result. We want a rule. We want people to stop fighting and move on with their lives. Nobody wants to keep going over the same thing over and over. It gets confusing, it gets difficult, it's expensive. Nobody wants to do that. So if they have jurisdiction, is the judgment final? Is it done? Is it concluded? And if you find that it is concluded and it was valid, then you go to the second question. And that's going to be, okay, even if it's valid and concluded and done, you have to ask, does it violate a public policy? Is there a public policy exception? If we enforce this judgment, will we be violating our own policy in order to enforce the judgment, even if they had jurisdiction over these people? Now, it's very hard to find a really strong public policy that would kind of undermine another judgment, but a good example would be if we have a judgment from another country and somebody brings that judgment to the United States and tries to, enforce it against somebody else, and the judgment had to do with child labor and about forcing someone to, or allowing someone to, employ a child under the age of 8 to work in a factory. That's going to violate a fundamental public policy across the United States, but in every single state as well. And because of that, even if that judgment is valid in your country, wherever you're from, we as a state in the U.S. are not going to honor it because it violates our public policy and we have an exception. So you can't just disallow or find a judgment invalid unless you have a good reason. So you have to have a strong reason under the public policy exception. If you don't, then it's going to be kind of hard for you to get around that. Let's say you don't have any public policy exception that would allow you to not enforce this judgment. Then you can go to the third one. So under the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, you have to see whether or not it applies. The full faith and credit would apply potentially if you're able to satisfy question 1 about jurisdiction, you're able to satisfy question 2 about public policy, that there's no issues. Then the third thing you have to look at is, okay, if we're able to satisfy both of these things, are we obligated to enforce this judgment under the full faith and credit clause? Remember, our full faith and credit clause requires us to respect the judgments and the laws of another state, of another country. Out of cooperation, we're required to oblige and give them kind of this additional level of consideration because they have their own state laws or their own country laws, and we should honor that because we are people of strong government and we understand the purpose of government and the principles behind it and la-di-da-di-da. So under the full faith and credit clause, if you satisfy both 1 and 2, you have to say, okay, well, are we obligated to follow this? And if we have no good reason to not follow it, then we have to enforce the judgment. Now, after you do an analysis for full faith and credit clause, if it says, we're not obligated to, or there's not a strong enough reason to do so, you can still move on to step 4, which talks about if the claim is a procedural or a substantive claim. That kind of goes back to like the major foundational analytical frameworks. And you're wondering probably, well, why is it important? Well, we're going to want to uphold more so a substantive claim than a procedural claim, because procedure is just about the court where something happened. And even though that can affect some things, it doesn't necessarily affect it as much as a substantive law claim. Remember, the substantive law is the teeth of the claim, the reason that we're in court in the first place, the reason that we're able to sue, the reason that we're trying to get a judgment in the first place. Was the judgment based on procedure or substance? And that will kind of, doesn't necessarily mean anything either way, but it really can help you solidify your answer when determining whether we're going to enforce a judgment or not. If the judgment was something as simple as, the days required to submit a motion in response, that might, weigh in favor of not enforcing the judgment, or it might weigh in favor of enforcing the judgment. It just depends on what's happening. The substance of a claim, though, is always going to be a little bit more important because it's about the reason that we're in court usually in the first place. Somebody assaulted another person. It's against the law to assault somebody. It's against the law to make them feel like they're going to die any day and that you're going to terrorize them for weeks on end. Like, that's against the law. It takes somebody's peace away. It takes their freedom away. This is a lot stronger of a claim than suing a prosecutor because they didn't file something within the deadline. That's important too, but when you're looking at substance versus procedure, substance has a higher weight a little bit, depending on the way the analysis goes for a judgment. Next, when you're looking at judgment, you have to ask yourself about preclusion. So preclusion, civ pro, civil procedure type of understanding and question to ask. There's 2 types. There's issue preclusion and claim preclusion. A claim is the entirety of what you're suing about. It's usually based on whatever you put in your actual lawsuit, your plea for help, your plea for resolution. So let's just say you are suing for your job back because you were fired falsely. The issue here would be the fact that somebody, fired you. That's also the claim. Now, if you break down the claim, is there more than one thing that you pled? Let's just say you pled that you lost your job falsely and it led to damages. Life, it hurt all of these things about you, right? You're looking at the claim, you're looking at drops. That led to your actual suit in the first place, which branches that come off of that. So let's say I sue for wrongful termination and I sue for damages for wrongful termination. That would be our claim. That claim that I brought to court, and it reached all levels of legal proceeding it could. Let's say I filed, I won, it was appealed, I won on that, they appealed it again, I won, there's nothing left that can be done, it's final, it's conclusive, it's done. And when it reached its last leg of being done, they said, no whether this claim is fully and fairly resolved and it will not be brought up again in any court. That is called a claim preclusion because the claim is precluded from being brought up again. Now we have issue preclusion. That is if I sued on that and then I decided to sue later on the damage to my reputation. Well, technically, issue preclusion is different than claim preclusion because the claim I brought was termination. And technically, that was the claim. Anything associated with the termination should be fully resolved, but I never discussed this issue specifically. So there's a difference between claim preclusion and issue preclusion because sometimes you can bring up an issue even after the claim is resolved. But typically, once the claim is fully resolved, anything that comes from that claim, if the claim is precluded now because they said everything related to this claim is done, technically I can't bring this issue. But what if I sued originally on this issue of my reputation being harmed because I lost my job? That's very different, very specific. And let's just say I sue on that. It goes through all the legal process, 2 appeals, I win both times. They say no other, discussion of this issue will be relitigated, it's final. Great. Can I go sue again about lost wages? Technically, yes, because the issue that was precluded was not the issue that had already been resolved. So when you're looking at a judgment, you have to look back and ask, okay, what has been resolved here? And the reason why is because if somebody is trying to sue, but there was a previous judgment, you have to see, okay, what did the judgment say? Was it a claim preclusion or an issue preclusion? If it was an issue preclusion, are they trying to sue again for the exact same thing? If they're trying to sue for the exact same thing in a different state, then it will likely not be able to be litigated because there will be what's called issue preclusion, and if we enforce the judgment in this state, we will say that we don't have to, and we will not allow this suit because it's already been litigated in another state, and we're going to enforce their judgment. If it is an issue preclusion and they're filing under a different issue, then we could enforce the judgment, but it really doesn't do anything to our current case. And what about if they file for a case and under a very specific claim and it was resolved fully, all that jazz, then they try to do the same claim again in another state? Well, that's going to be kicked out because we're going to enforce that judgment because it's already been decided. Now there is an exception, and the exception is for workers' compensation. Under the Washington Light case, somebody sued a state for an actual compensation claim and they won, and then they went to another state and filed again for a supplemental claim. As long as the claim is supplemental, technically that's the exception, and the judgment will not be enforced because we can always add on to a supplemental claim. We can always add on to an original claim for workers' compensation. And the reason behind that is, even though it's been fully and fairly discussed, it's an administrative board that sits in the workers' compensation for every single state. Because it is somebody that's from a different state, technically they are not going to be the law of the land. They're not going to influence other workers' compensation administrative sections like it would in a court. It's not the same type of resolution. Administrative boards are slightly different, and because of that we will allow it. And also it's not the same thing as relitigating. We're not trying to figure out who is right or wrong. We're just adding on to something that was already given. Although some hold it to be unjust enrichment, it is still considered fair because technically the boards are different, and if they come to the conclusion this person should get more money, they can because they're separate. Now if it's hard to remember these, the biggest thing with the judgment on whether you enforce it is if they had proper jurisdiction, if their solution was reasonable, if it was valid and final, and if there's no public policy that breaches it. You just ask those, you're fine. But technically, these are the 5 steps you have to ask when determining if you're going to enforce a judgment or not, or if it is even a valid judgment to enforce. And I believe that's it. Good luck.